You look at the news right now, and you see all the division, the protests, the political tension, and it just feels like a moment where you have to ask, how did we even get here?
Yeah.
Why does it feel like the country is, I don't know, coming apart? One of the sources you shared even used this phrase, a terrifying turning point.
It really does feel that way for a lot of people, doesn't it? That sense of deep unease, it's pretty widespread.
Absolutely. And, that feeling is exactly the impulse behind this deep dive. You came to us with this whole stack of sources, articles, research papers, your own notes, all wrestling with this exact question, trying to make sense of this turbulent period.
Right. And the material you provided, it includes analysis from places like the New Republic, the Yale Law Journal, the reports from PBS, the World Socialist website, and others too. And it offers a look into the roots and impacts of political polarization, sure, but also maybe something more fundamental, something these sources are calling fragmentation in the U.S.
All right. So our mission here in this deep dive, it's pretty straightforward. We're not here to take sides in all the current political fights.
No.
Our job is more like being guides through your sources to understand what they say is most important about why our political system feels so stuck, so divided, so fragmented, as you said. We're just going to unpack the key insights, maybe some surprising facts that your materials lay out.
Makes sense.
All right, let's unpack this.
So the picture painted by these sources of the current landscape, it's certainly one of pretty significant disarray and tension.
Yeah, it really comes through strongly. Your sources, they highlight a specific day, Saturday, June 14th, 2025, as a kind of snapshot. You had these nationwide No Kings marches against President Trump. The sources are estimating millions participated all across the country.
Right, huge numbers.
Yeah, major cities like Philly, LA, New York, Austin, complete with, powerful chants and imagery, that striking puppet of Trump on a golden toilet, for instance.
And this huge wave of protest was contrasted, according to the sources, with a military parade happening in Washington, D.C. at the same time.
Right.
And while its stated purpose is mentioned, the sources also note things like, poor attendance. It seemed to underscore a lack of broad public buy-in, maybe, compared to the protest movement.
But it wasn't all just peaceful demonstration, was it? Your sources also point to some genuinely disturbing violent events happening around that.
Unfortunately, yes.
They mention political assassinations or attacks in Minnesota. The suspect reportedly had No Kings flyers, writings about political figures in their car. And then that shocking incident in Culpeper, Virginia, a car driven into a crowd of protesters.
And the New Republic source, it specifically pulls these different events together. It suggests the country is, quote, lurching toward a state of violence, not seen here since the 1970s.
Wow.
And what's critical about that source's analysis is its distinction. It says today's violence feels, different.
Yeah.
Not just like an isolated incident here or there, but potentially becoming a feature of American life.
A feature.
Yeah, and even draws really stark comparison to places like Libya in its analysis.
That's a heavy comparison from that source. And in that context, one source brings up the ACL8 conflict index, suggesting the U.S. domestic environment is, less peaceful now compared to countries like Iceland or New Zealand.
Yeah, it's a worrying indicator cited there. But it's also important, and the sources themselves do this, to present the full picture.
Right.
They note that while, yes, there were isolated confrontations at some protests, tear gas in L.A., police on horseback in some places, they also emphasize that the nationwide demonstrations were, by and large, peaceful. The No Kings Coalition statement, for example, is quoted saying, Americans stood in peaceful unity.
Okay, so different sources bring different analyses to the table. One source specifically describes the violence in Minnesota and Virginia as coming from far-right elements.
That's noted, yes.
And the New Republic analysis, it explicitly argues that America's culture of violence is driven by the right. It ties some extremists to support for Trump, mentions January 6th in that context.
Right.
And again, just to be clear, we're presenting this as the analysis contained within those specific sources you provided, not our own take.
Exactly. And it's this turbulent, kind of complex backdrop described in your materials that makes the next part so vital. Trying to understand the underlying causes of all this division and paralysis.
Right. And this is where the sources really start to, dig deeper. They introduce a core idea. Maybe to really get at the current paralysis we feel, just talking about polarization isn't quite enough.
That's a really key point made by political scientist Richard Pieltz. He's cited a lot in the Yale Law Journal piece and the briefing document you had. He introduces and focuses on this concept of political fragmentation. And his definition is crucial here. It's the diffusion of political power away from the political parties themselves.
Away from the parties? How so?
Well, it happens both externally, power moving to independent groups, individuals, think super PACs, and internally, power moving away from the party leadership and towards individual members, individual office holders.
Huh. So it's not just that Democrats and Republicans are miles apart on issues, which is, what we usually mean by polarization.
Exactly.
But that the parties themselves are weaker as organizations, less able to control their own members or act together.
Precisely. And the argument from these sources is that this fragmentation is actually a more important focus than just polarization for explaining why American government feels so, broken, so paralyzed. They give examples like government shutdowns, where the problem wasn't necessarily that the parties were too far apart ideologically, but that the party leaders literally couldn't bring their own, maybe more extreme factions into line to make the deals needed to govern.
And Pieltz offers this really provocative thought, which one source paraphrases: maybe the problem isn't that our parties are too much like parliamentary parties, where leaders have more clout.
Right.
But actually that they're not parliamentary-like enough, not enough ability to lead, negotiate, get their members on board effectively.
Yeah, it kind of turns the conventional wisdom on its head a little bit. And this fragmentation, according to the sources, it isn't just some recent thing. They trace its roots way back. Deep, long-term factors, structural things about the U.S. system, specific legal changes over time, even cultural tendencies.
Okay, let's start with the structural issues then, because your sources really seem to emphasize how unique the American system is in some way.
They really do.
They point out the sheer number of elected officials in the U.S., over 500,000.
Staggering.
Which is vastly more per person than any other country. And it includes things we don't always think about, like elected judges, elected prosecutors. That's pretty rare globally.
Yes, and related to that structure, there's a notable lack of independent institutions for things like electoral oversight, stuff that's common in other democracies.
What?
Oh, things like dedicated electoral courts or genuinely independent commissions to draw district lines. Here, that control often stays with partisan elected officials, which, the sources argue, embeds partisanship deeper into the actual machinery of the system.
I see. They also highlight the number of federal jobs needing Senate confirmation, something like 1,300 positions.
Yeah, a huge number. And one source argues this makes the whole administrative state, the bureaucracy, highly subject to political control, maybe patronage, unlike systems where the professional civil service is more insulated. There's even a historical parallel drawn in one source to the uniquely fragmented U.S. banking system for much of its history, which that source describes as being, quote, crippled by populism.
Crippled by populism.
Yeah, suggesting this long-standing cultural preference, maybe, in the U.S. for decentralized power, for direct popular control, which might ironically make effective institutions harder to build and maintain.
And speaking of direct popular control, the sources also mention widespread use of direct democracy tools in many states. Initiatives, referenda, recall elections.
Right, bypassing the formal institutions.
Sources see that as another piece of this fragmentation puzzle, driven by that very American emphasis on direct democracy over, say, more purely representative structures.
So you've got the unique structure, but the sources also heavily emphasize the weakening of the political parties themselves over time.
How so?
They starkly contrast American parties, describing them as sort of skeletal, with no formal membership dues, little real power over who runs under their banner, compared to the much stronger, more disciplined parties you see in most other democracies.
And this weakening, it wasn't just an accident, according to these sources.
No, they argue that certain reforms, often intended for good reasons, like popular empowerment, have had these unintended consequences.
Like what kind of reforms?
Well, short 2-year House terms, for instance, keep politicians in constant campaign mode, but especially the spread of primary elections.
Ah, primaries.
Yeah, introduced back in the progressive era, specifically to make parties subject to popular control, sometimes even letting non-party members vote in them. This significantly weakened the party's ability to unify candidates or, frankly, discipline members who didn't toe the line.
Makes sense.
The overturning of the seniority system in Congress back in '74 is also cited, while the goal was to democratize power inside Congress.
Right, break up the old guard.
Exactly. But sources argue it inadvertently diffused power away from stable leadership structures, creating more veto points, more places where legislation could get held up or influenced by narrow interests.
Okay, and then there's campaign finance. Your sources seem to suggest this is a huge piece of the puzzle.
Oh, absolutely. A major driver discussed in your sources.
Yeah.
They argue that reforms starting way back, post-Watergate in the 70s, shifted the whole system dramatically towards a candidate-centered financing model.
Candidate-centered.
Yeah.
Meaning different from how it works elsewhere.
Fundamentally different, they argue, from Europe's generally party-centered model. Here, key legal actions, legislative changes like the soft money ban and McCain-Feingold, and court cases like Buckley v. Vallejo and later Citizens United.
Right, the big ones.
The interpretation of those, according to these sources, effectively pushed money away from the official party organizations.
And
towards independent groups, super PACs. It empowers individual candidates and these outside entities much more than the central party structures, which might otherwise try to moderate candidates or unify different factions within the party.
And here's a finding from the sources that, I gotta say, I found particularly surprising, illuminating maybe. Candidates now rely heavily on individual donors, and these donors, as a group, tend to be significantly more ideologically extreme than the general population, even more extreme than average party voters.
That's a critical piece of the puzzle, according to the sources. And they go even further. They note that now a majority of individual contributions actually come from out-of-state donors.
Wow, a majority from out of state.
Yeah. And who are these out-of-state donors? Often, they are among the most ideologically extreme contributors of all.
So what's the effect of that?
Well, it creates this powerful incentive structure for elected officials, right?
Yeah.
Their campaign funding, maybe their political survival, depends more on pleasing these highly ideological, often geographically distant donors, potentially more than their own local constituents, which inevitably pushes them towards the ideological poles.
It creates this feedback loop, catering to the extremes to get funded.
Exactly. It's interesting, though. Pildes, in the source material, makes a kind of counterintuitive argument about that McCutcheon Supreme Court case, the one that lifted the aggregate limits on how much an individual could give overall to all candidates and parties.
Okay.
He suggests, kind of controversially, that this might actually have a potential positive effect in the context of fragmentation. His argument, as presented in the sources, is that by allowing individuals to give more overall, it could encourage more money to flow back to the parties.
And why would that be good, in his view?
Because, he argues, the parties, unlike single-issue super PACs, have to balance a wider range of interests. So they're better equipped to sort of dilute the influence of any single extreme donor compared to the current proliferation of independent groups.
Huh. That's definitely thinking outside the box.
It is. Another set of factors your sources point to involves transparency laws and the ban on earmarks.
Right. There's a critique in the sources about, well, what they see is maybe excessive transparency.
Yeah, laws like the Government in the Sunshine Act, intended to open up government, obviously a good goal.
Sure.
But arguably, they made negotiation harder. Sources cite actual senators who said that requiring meetings to be open basically killed their ability to have candid discussions, make necessary trade-offs to reach compromise. It forces public posturing instead of private deal-making.
And earmarks, that seems related. The ban on those targeted spending items in bills.
Exactly. While popular, fighting pork barrel spending.
Right. It sounds good on the surface.
It's presented in the sources as having removed a key tool that party leaders use to build coalitions, to literally grease the wheels for legislation. Earmarks could give members a reason and incentive to vote for big bills they weren't totally thrilled about. Without that tool, compromise and deal-making become much harder.
Okay, so we have structure, parties weakening, campaign finance, transparency, earmarks. What else?
Well, layered on top of all that, you have modern communication technology.
Ah, the internet, social media.
Right. They allow individual politicians to completely bypass party structures, build personal brands, mobilize narrow factions directly. It further diffuses power away from any central control.
And the algorithms.
Exactly. The algorithms inherent in social media are specifically cited as creating these powerful echo chambers. They constantly reinforce our existing biases, limit exposure to different views, and just deepen the very divisions the sources are trying to analyze.
Which leads us, I guess, to the final major cause the sources discuss, political tribalism.
Yeah. They define it pretty simply as, quote, loyalty to one's perceived group and treating outsiders as threats.
Sounds familiar.
Right. And While they acknowledge, look, tribalism has roots in basic human social nature, forming groups.
Yeah.
The sources highlight specific modern drivers that amplify it. Things like ideological silos from partisan news media, group polarization effects where online interactions actually push people to more extreme views, economic inequality, which can foster perceived competition between groups, and identity politics, the focus on specific identities like gender, race, etc., which, if not handled carefully, can create deeper divisions rather than understanding.
It's a crucial point the sources make, though, that only a small fraction of people actually hold truly hateful extreme views.
Absolutely.
But the fragmented political system, the communication landscape, according to these sources, they create incentives and dynamics that encourage this kind of tribal behavior, this us versus them thinking, even among people who aren't themselves deeply extreme.
That's right. The system itself fosters it. And the impacts of all this fragmentation and tribalism, as cited in your sources, they're significant. They're interconnected.
Like what? What are the big impacts?
Well, persistent policy gridlock is one. A degradation of public discourse where, dishonesty is tolerated if it serves your side.
Mm-hmm.
Even democratic erosion, that worrying trend of people being willing to support populist leaders from their tribe, even if those leaders undermine democratic norms or institutions.
Scary stuff.
It also fuels the spread of misinformation. And crucially, it erodes trust. Trust in vital institutions, the media, the judiciary, the electoral system itself.
Okay, so after walking through this really complex web of causes, the unique structure, the weakening parties, campaign finance, transparency laws, technology, tribalism, what does this all ultimately mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of things?
It means, as the sources argue, that the feeling you have, that sense of governmental paralysis, deep societal division, it's a direct consequence of these forces.
It's not just in our heads.
No. The intense partisanship, which is made worse by this underlying fragmentation, makes effective governance incredibly difficult. According to the sources, it directly hinders our ability to tackle the big challenges facing the country, things like economic progress, health, security, and education.
And as we just touched on, it contributes to that widespread erosion of trust in the very institutions that are supposed to hold society together and solve problems.
But, your sources don't just diagnose the problem. They do also touch on potential pathways forward. They offer various solutions, ideas for renewal, often drawing lessons from the causes they identify.
Okay, what kind of solutions are proposed in the material?
Well, one of the more controversial suggestions, coming directly from Pild's analysis and discussed in the sources, is actually counterintuitive again. Maybe strengthening political parties.
Strengthening them after saying they're part of the problem.
Well, strengthening their ability to act cohesively. The idea here is to allow parties more power, maybe by letting them coordinate, spending more directly with candidates, channeling more money through the party organizations, instead of all these outside groups.
Then the logic there is.
The argument is that stronger, more centralized parties might actually be more capable of enabling the necessary compromise, the deal-making required for effective governance, than the current fragmented landscape allows. Because again, they have to balance a wider array of interests than some narrow super PAC.
Interesting. What else?
Electoral reforms are also presented as potential tools. The sources mention ideas like independent redistricting commissions to try and reduce gerrymandering, ranked choice voting, RCV, which some argue might favor less extreme candidates, and even fusion voting, letting candidates appear on multiple party lines as ways that could potentially lead to more competitive elections, maybe temper ideological extremes in legislators, or just give more entry points for citizens who feel kind of politically homeless right now.
Beyond the structural fixes, the sources also seem to emphasize a shift in mindset, moving beyond just blind party loyalty.
Absolutely. There's a call to, quote, choose to see people for who they are and their ideas and values, not for a tribe or their political party.
Easier said than done sometimes.
For sure. The concept of principled conservatism is offered in one source as an example of this kind of thinking, judging your own party's actions by fixed moral principles rather than just rationalizing whatever they do because they're on your side.
Right, and promoting bipartisanship, dialogue.
Crucial. Actively seeking to respect others' opinions, focusing on areas of common concern where maybe progress is still possible, even with big disagreements elsewhere.
And what about citizens? What role do they play?
Citizen mobilization is seen as vital. The sources point to civil society organizations, grassroots efforts working to build coalitions for specific reforms. They mention groups like Represent Us and their reported successes in pushing for things like ranked choice voting or independent redistricting at state and local levels.
Okay. And there were some global examples mentioned, too.
Yeah, finally, the sources briefly look outside the U.S., not necessarily as direct prescriptions like do this here, but as different models of societies grappling with deep divisions or tribalism.
Oh.
They mention Rwanda's Gacaca courts, which focused on reconciliation after the genocide, New Zealand's Treaty of Waitangi settlements, addressing historical injustices with the Maori people, and even the Fridays for Future movement as an example of uniting huge numbers of people around a shared goal, like climate action, across traditional divides, different approaches to bridging gaps.
So, wow, we've journeyed through quite a bit here. The current turbulent state, that critical distinction the sources make between polarization and fragmentation, and then exploring this really complex web of underlying factors, structural, legal, cultural, especially the weakening of political parties and the unintended consequences of some well-meaning reforms, all things your sources point to as driving forces behind America's political dysfunction.
And as the material suggests, really understanding these deep roots, these interconnected causes, it's arguably the essential first step. Just understanding it is huge before you can even think about a path forward, no matter how maybe daunting the current situation feels.
Absolutely. And, it leaves us with this really powerful thought from your sources to kind of mull over. Given this analysis that specifically American cultural values, emphasizing individualism, direct popular participation have, according to these sources, ironically contributed to creating dysfunctional, fragmented institutions.
Yeah.
What might a more realistic, maybe less romanticized vision of American democracy look like? And is it truly possible for the U.S. to embrace elements of that more pragmatic vision, even when it challenges some of our most deeply held beliefs about how democracy should ideally work?
That is a fundamental question, isn't it? Posed by the very sources you brought to this deep dive. A lot to think about.